Have you ever wondered why people in the Middle Ages, farmers, peasants, and monks, might have worked less than you do today? It sounds impossible, doesn't it? A world without machines, without electricity, without modern comfort. And yet, they had more rest, more holidays, and more time to simply exist. Before alarm clocks and factory shifts, time moved differently. The day began with the sun, ended with the stars, and was interrupted often by bells, calling not to work, but to pause. In this story, we'll step quietly into that slower world. A world where a third of the year was spent in feast or holy day, where winter meant rest by the fire, and where no one could work longer than daylight would allow, so lie back. Close your eyes if you wish, and as the bells of a faraway village begin to ring, let's drift backward to a time when people worked less, slept more, and lived by the rhythm of the earth itself. The day begins slowly in the medieval countryside. There is no alarm clock, no shrill ringtone, no fluorescent light. The rooster crows, but not as a command. It is simply part of the morning's music, a sound that tells you, if you are awake enough to listen, that dawn is near. Somewhere, a church bell will soon toll prime, the first of the canonical hours, and that gentle echo will drift through fields still wet with dew. It is the 14th century, and the day begins not with urgency, but with awareness. You are a farmer's laborer, perhaps, or a small tenant on a patch of land in rural England, France, or Flanders. The air smells faintly of smoke and hay. When you rise, there is no schedule written down, no time card to punch. The day's work depends on the sky, on the brightness of the morning, the dampness of the soil, the season, and the will of the Lord whose land you farm. And though the work will be hard, there will also be time. Time to eat, to talk, to pray, and to rest. The popular image of medieval life, one of endless toil, grinding poverty, and ceaseless servitude, has long persisted. Paintings and modern retellings often show peasants bent double in muddy fields, starved and overworked while lords feast in castles above them. There is truth in the hardship, yes, but not in the rhythm. The medieval world was slow, deliberate, and in many ways, far less exhausting than the one you live in now. In our modern age, people work more hours than medieval peasants ever did. The average person today, whether in an office, a warehouse, or behind a screen, spends somewhere between 1,700 and 2,000 hours a year working. A medieval peasant, by contrast, likely worked around 1,200 to 1,500 hours annually, depending on the season and their obligations. That difference, hundreds of hours each year, meant something profound. It meant time to live, to socialize, to sit in silence while the fire burned low. It meant the world turned at a human pace. To understand why medieval people worked less, you must first understand how their world measured time. Time, in the medieval mind, was not a fixed quantity to be bought, sold, or wasted. It was an element of divine order, part of the rhythm of God's creation. The sun rose and fell according to his design. Seasons followed each other with patience. And work, too, was seen as cyclical, not linear. There was no progress to be chased, no ladder to climb. There was simply the maintenance of life, the steady repetition of the tasks that sustained family, village, and faith. Mechanical clocks existed, but only as marvels. A handful of great towns, Milan, Paris, Salzburg, possessed them, their gears turning in bell towers high above the market squares. But for the average person, time was kept by the bell, the sun, and the body. A day began when there was enough light to see your hands, and it ended when darkness fell. No one counted minutes because minutes did not matter. The smallest useful measure of time was an hour, and even that was flexible, for hours grew longer or shorter depending on the season. A summer hour might stretch to 75 minutes of modern reckoning. A winter one might last barely 45. This fluidity created a softness in the structure of work. A man might plow until the sun stood high, then stop for a meal, then work again until shadows lengthened. He would not be idle, but neither would he rush. There was no boss demanding constant output, no abstract goal of efficiency. Labor had meaning only in relation to the needs of the day. And there were many days in which no labor was required at all. The medieval calendar was a patchwork of holy days, feast days, and fasts, an astonishing array of pauses woven through the year. In Catholic Europe, before the Reformation, nearly 1/3 of all days were in some sense holidays. Sundays, of course, were sacred and free from work, but so were the feast days of saints, the great festivals of the church, and the long periods surrounding Christmas, Easter, and harvest time. A villager might work steadily for 2 or 3 weeks, only to be met with a 3-day celebration of St. Michael or St. Martin, complete with processions, music, and food. On such days, labor was forbidden by both custom and law. The punishment for breaking the Sabbath was not merely social, it was considered a sin. And yet, even when people worked, their tasks were fragmented and varied. A farmer's year was not one of unbroken field work. In winter, the fields were frozen, the days too short for much labor. Men and women spent those months repairing tools, tending animals, spinning wool, and resting by the hearth. Work was communal and seasonal, with bursts of intensity, the plowing, the haymaking, the harvest, followed by long lulls. In those quieter months, time seemed to stretch, unhurried and indefinite. Life was governed not by deadlines, but by daylight. The notion of full employment would have made no sense to a medieval mind. Work was not a moral obligation, but a practical necessity, balanced against the need for prayer, family, and rest. Monks, perhaps, came closest to what we might call a disciplined schedule. Under the rule of Saint Benedict, monasteries divided the day into 8 canonical hours, balancing labor and devotion. Ora et labora, said the rule, pray and work. But even within those walls, rest was honored. The monks rose before dawn for matins, chanted their prayers, then returned to sleep. Meals were slow, conversations hushed, and afternoons often punctuated with contemplation. They worked, yes, but they also paused, believing that rest was part of divine order. Outside those cloisters, the rhythm was rougher but not harsher. Villages worked together. A plow team might belong to several families, each taking turns using it. Harvests were community efforts. Hay was stacked collectively. The social expectation was not relentless productivity, but cooperation. You worked until the job was done, and then you stopped. A field could not be plowed faster than oxen could walk. A loaf of bread could not bake faster than the fire would allow. Nature imposed its limits, and those limits were accepted in this world. Idleness was not yet the great sin it would later become. The Protestant Reformation and the rise of capitalism would eventually transform the idea of work into a moral virtue. The Protestant work ethic, as Max Weber famously described it. But in the early medieval centuries, rest was a sign of faith, not failure. To rest was to acknowledge that man was not master of time, but part of it. This is not to say medieval people lived lives of ease. Hardship was real and often brutal. Famine struck with little warning. Disease swept through villages. And life expectancy was short. But even those who suffered did so in a world less enslaved by the clock. The human body had rhythms, waking, eating, working, sleeping, that were honored rather than overridden. There was no electric light to extend the day, no factory whistle to demand attendance. When darkness fell, people rested, not out of laziness, but because the world itself rested. The rise of towns brought change, of course. By the 13th century, cities like Florence, Ghent, and London were bustling centers of craft and trade. Guilds regulated every trade, from blacksmiths to weavers to candle makers. But even there, the structure of labor was mild by modern standards. Guild statutes often set maximum working hours, typically from dawn until dusk, and for bad night work, both for safety and for moral reasons. Masters were required to allow apprentices time for meals, prayer, and holy days. A craftsman might work 6 days a week, but his day would end when the light failed. The absence of artificial light was, paradoxically, the great protector of leisure. If you walked through a medieval town in the late afternoon, you might see shutters closing on shops, children playing in the narrow lanes, and families gathering around open hearths. The air would smell of wood smoke and cooking meat. Work had ended not because a clock said it should, but because the world itself had dimmed. The rhythm of nature had called a halt. It is strange, perhaps, to think that the people of that slow, uncertain world might have enjoyed more rest than you, that the peasants of medieval Europe, with all their poverty and vulnerability, might have lived with more leisure than the modern professional with their ergonomic chair and weekend emails. But the records bear it out. Scholars who have combed through manorial rolls, wage accounts, and church calendars have found again and again that the medieval work year was punctuated by rest. The great historian Juliet Schor, in her study The Overworked American, notes that the medieval peasant worked far fewer hours annually than the modern worker, sometimes by as much as a third. The difference lies not in laziness, but in the meaning of labor. In the medieval world, there was no compulsion to constantly produce, because there was no concept of growth as an end in itself. A village that had enough grain, enough wool, enough tools, did not strive for more. Surplus was not accumulation, but insurance. Trade existed, but the hunger for expansion, for infinite productivity, had not yet taken hold. That came later, with clocks, merchants, and machines. The invention of the mechanical clock in the late 13th century marked the first quiet tremor of that change. In the great bell towers of European cities, gears turned and bells rang not merely to mark prayer, but to divide time itself. At first, it was a curiosity, a marvel of engineering. But as towns grew and commerce expanded, the clock became a tool of discipline. Hours became fixed, measurable, equal. A merchant could say when a delivery was due, a master could demand punctuality, and time, once fluid and divine, became a commodity. This new time began to reshape society. Monasteries adopted stricter schedules. City workers found their days more rigid. Bells tolled not just for worship, but for work. By the 16th century, with the rise of Protestantism and capitalism, idleness had come to be seen as a vice. Time, now measurable, was something to be spent wisely. To waste time was to sin, not against God, but against productivity. And so began the slow unraveling of the medieval rhythm. As markets expanded and machines arrived, the pattern of rest gave way to the pattern of the clock. The Industrial Revolution would finish what the first clocks had begun, turning time into labor, and labor into profit. But before all that, there was a different kind of peace. Imagine, if you will, a summer's day in 1320 in a small village in Normandy. The wheat fields ripple like gold under a soft wind. Men and women work side by side, swinging scythes, stacking sheaves, laughing between strokes. Children chase each other near the hedges. The air is full of dust and song. As the sun leans westward, the reeve, the village official, calls an end to the day's work. They will return tomorrow, early, but for now it is enough. They gather near a thatched barn, share bread, cheese, and ale, and watch the sky turn red. The bell in the distant abbey rings vespers, calling the faithful to prayer. No one hurries. There is no evening shift, no spreadsheet waiting at home, no clock ticking down their minutes. There is only the slow darkening of the world and the comfort of being alive within it. These moments of stillness were not luxury. They were necessity. The body and the spirit required them. Even the poorest households found time to pause, to brew ale, mend clothes, tell stories by firelight. In those stories lived memory, the tales of saints and kings, of floods and miracles, of ancestors whose names were spoken softly so as not to be lost. Time passed, but not quickly. The medieval year was a circle, not a line. It returned upon itself, winter to spring, spring to harvest, harvest to rest. And each turn of that circle was both new and familiar. What might surprise you most, perhaps, is that medieval people talked about rest. Chroniclers and preachers alike reminded their audiences that overwork was foolish. In a sermon from the 13th century, a priest in northern France warned that the man who toils without measure labors against his soul. Another, writing in England, said that the Sabbath was not merely a day of prayer, but a medicine for weariness. These were not idle words. They reflected a worldview that saw balance, not ambition, as the goal of life. Contrast that with the modern sentiment that success demands sacrifice, that rest must be earned. It is a curious inversion of values. Medieval society, for all its superstition and rigidity, accepted human limitation with a kind of grace. The world was hard enough without inventing new burdens. To rest was not to fall behind. It was simply to live rightly. And yet, that older rhythm has nearly vanished. The clock, the machine, and the market have consumed it. We live now in a world of constant light, constant sound, constant expectation. The workday stretches beyond its borders, the weekend shrinks, and rest feels like rebellion. We are surrounded by time-saving devices, yet never have enough time. The medieval peasant, who could not read or write, might have pitied us for that. Perhaps that is why the subject feels strangely comforting to revisit. In studying the slow world of the Middle Ages, its feast days, its bells, its patient seasons, we glimpse an alternative way of being. Not a paradise, but a pace. A recognition that work has meaning only within the rhythm of rest, and that human life cannot be measured entirely in hours. At night, in that same village, the fire burns low. Outside, the fields are dark and still. The stars shimmer faintly above the thatched roofs. You can hear the soft creak of wood, the murmur of voices fading into sleep. Somewhere an owl calls. Time moves, but gently. Tomorrow will come when it chooses, not by the alarm's demand, but by the first gray light seeping through the cracks of the shutters. There will be work, yes, but also laughter, meals, and moments of silence between the tolling of the bells. You, the modern reader, may close your eyes and imagine that sound, the slow toll of a bell over distant hills, and feel, if only faintly, what it meant to live in a world where time belonged not to money, but to life itself. And that is why medieval people, in all their simplicity and superstition, worked less than you do today. Not because they were lazy, but because they belonged to a world that had not yet learned how to measure its own heartbeat. If you're still awake, thank you for staying with me until the end of this quiet journey through time. And if you drifted off somewhere along the way, that's perfectly fine too. That's what we're here for. Every week, we share slow stories from the forgotten corners of history. Stories meant to calm your mind and help you rest. If you enjoyed this quiet escape, please take a moment, just a small, sleepy moment, to like this video and subscribe to Quiet Boring Sleep. It helps the channel grow, and it lets me keep making more peaceful stories for you to fall asleep to. Until next time, rest well. And may your dreams be filled with gentle history.